There is an organization that has handed out over $1 trillion to the world's poorest countries, and almost nobody can explain what it actually does. Not the politicians who fund it, not the economists who debate it, and definitely not the countries that desperately need it. So let's fix that right now. It's 1944. World War II is almost over. Europe is rubble. Japan is ash. Entire cities have been physically destroyed, not metaphorically, actually blown up. The leaders of 44 nations gather in a small hotel in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. They have one question on the table. How do we rebuild an entire planet? Their answer was simple. Build a bank. Not a bank for people, a bank for countries. A place where poor nations could borrow money to rebuild roads, bridges, schools, and hospitals. A place that would give loans when no one else would. And just like that, the World Bank was born. Headquartered in Washington, D.C., backed by the world's most powerful economies. And ready to change the planet. What does it actually do? Here is where most explanations lose you. They say things like the World Bank provides financial and technical assistance to developing countries, and you nod politely and understand absolutely nothing. So let's try a different way. Imagine you are a small country. You have natural resources in the ground, people who need jobs, and zero money to build anything. You go to a regular bank. The regular bank looks at your credit history, looks at your political instability, looks at your weak currency, and says, no, not today, not ever. This is where the World Bank walks in. The World Bank says yes. It offers loans at very low interest rates. It gives long repayment periods. For the absolute poorest countries, it sometimes gives money at nearly 0% interest over 40 years. In some cases, it gives grants, which is money that never needs to be paid back at all. Between 1944 and today, the World Bank has financed over 12,000 projects in 173 countries. Roads, dams, hospitals, schools, clean water systems, power grids. 12,000 projects. That is not a small operation. But here is something most people do not know. The World Bank is actually two separate institutions that share the same name. The first one is called the IBRD, which stands for International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. This one works with middle-income countries like Brazil, India, and Indonesia. These are countries that are developing, but not in extreme poverty. They get loans at below-market rates, and they have to pay the money back. The second one is called the IDA, which stands for International Development Association. This one works with the poorest countries on Earth, countries like Chad, Haiti, and Afghanistan. These countries get near-zero interest loans, sometimes grants, because they simply cannot afford anything else. Together, these two institutions lend about $100 billion every single year. Now, here is the part of the story that gets complicated. The World Bank does not just hand over money and walk away. It comes with conditions. And this is where opinions on the World Bank get very divided very fast. In the 1980s and 1990s, the World Bank pushed a set of policies that required countries to cut government spending, privatize state-owned companies, and open their economies to free markets in exchange for loans. The thinking was that a leaner, more open economy would grow faster and repay debt more easily. In some countries this worked. In many others, it did not. Governments that cut spending on food subsidies saw food prices spike. Workers who had stable public sector jobs lost them almost overnight. Some countries followed these policies closely and ended up poorer than before. Meanwhile, other countries like South Korea and China quietly ignored the advice and built some of the most successful economies in modern history. This is still one of the most debated questions in economics today. Does outside help with conditions attached actually help the people it is meant for? Or does it mostly serve the interests of the people attaching the conditions? Nobody has a clean answer, which is uncomfortable, but it is honest. The power problem. Here is another detail that rarely gets talked about. The World Bank runs on a voting system. The more money a country contributes, the more votes it gets. The United States holds roughly 15 to 17% of total votes. That sounds modest until you realize that most major decisions require 85% agreement to pass, which means America alone can block any major decision it does not like. That is a veto, a permanent one. Also, every single president of the World Bank in its entire 80-year history has been an American citizen. Every one. This is not written in the rules. It is simply an informal tradition that has never been broken. China today represents about 18% of the entire global economy. Its voting share at the World Bank is around 5%. The continent of Africa, which is home to 54 countries and 1.4 billion people, holds a combined voting share of roughly 6%. The people who need the loans the most have the least say in how the institution is run. That is not a conspiracy. It is just how the math works out. And it makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. For most of its history, the World Bank operated quietly in the background of global finance. Important but invisible to most people. Then, 2020 arrived. COVID-19 hits the global economy like a truck. Low-income countries face collapsing tax revenues, spiking health costs, and supply chains that simply stop working. Tourism disappears, remittances dry up. Governments that were barely keeping up before are now in freefall. The World Bank responds and responds fast. It approves $157 billion in emergency financing over 15 months, the largest crisis response in its entire history. And yet, it still was not enough. Countries that urgently needed funds were waiting months while applications moved through standard review processes. Procedures that make complete sense in normal times became obstacles in an emergency. Madagascar could not feed people while paperwork was being processed. The Democratic Republic of Congo was fighting an Ebola outbreak in real time while waiting for disbursements. The World Bank did more than almost any institution on Earth during that period, and it still could not move fast enough to match the scale of what was happening. That is the central tension of every large institution. The rules that make it trustworthy are the same rules that make it slow. Here is what $1 trillion looks like when it reaches actual human beings. In Bangladesh, World Bank funding helped bring electricity to over 50 million people who had never had it before. Children who previously studied by candlelight could now stay up after dark and read. Clinics that could not previously refrigerate vaccines could now do so. In Ethiopia, World Bank roads connected rural farmers to city markets for the first time. Some farmers saw their incomes triple within a decade simply because they could now sell what they grew. In India, World Bank financing helped lay some of the early groundwork for one of the most significant poverty reduction efforts in modern history. These things happened. They are real. They affected real families. And also real was the Narmada Dam project in India, which the World Bank helped finance and which displaced somewhere between 200,000 and 400,000 people, most of them from indigenous and low-income communities, many of whom were never properly compensated and never properly resettled. The World Bank eventually withdrew from the project after years of international criticism. Both of these things are true at the same time. The same institution that helped light up a village also helped flood one. This is what operating at global scale actually looks like. It does not get to be purely good or purely bad. It just gets to be enormously consequential. The World Bank is not a villain. It is not a hero either. it is something more interesting than both. It is an 80-year-old solution that is still trying to solve problems it was never originally designed for. It was built by people who had watched the world collapse twice in 30 years and desperately wanted to prevent a third time. They built the best institution they could imagine, with the tools they had, with the power structures that existed in 1944, for a world that no longer exists. The real question is not whether the World Bank is good or bad. The real question is what a fair version of this institution looks like. Who gets a vote? Who sets the terms? Who decides what development even means? The people writing the checks, or the people who have to live with the results? $1 trillion. Over 100 million lives touched directly. And humanity still has not agreed on the answer. Maybe that is the most expensive open question we have ever left unresolved.